Hello, I'm Clyde Mitchell, conductor of Lions Gate Sinfonia, right here on the beautiful North Shore of Vancouver, British Columbia. I hope this finds you all well and safe and healthy and happy during these very strange times. Welcome to our next installment of Clyde Chats, where we talk about subjects of interest to musicians and music lovers. We're also happy to take your requests and questions and discuss any musical subject that interests you, our Sinfonia friends, subscribers, and patrons. Just drop us a line at lionsgatesinfonia.com. This edition of Sinfonia's Clyde Chats will be the first of a series of overviews of the 4 different families of instruments and all their members: the strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a piece of music that was designed to introduce all of the instruments. It's called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra by the English composer Benjamin Britten. Well, what we're going to be doing is much better than listening to that wonderful old war horse, a traditional piece that is often played at children's concerts. Here, we're going to go through each instrument and see and hear a member of Lions Gate Sinfonia talk about their instrument and what got them started in music and why they chose the violin or the cello and later on the clarinet or flute or the trumpet or trombone or percussion. For this episode of Clyde Chats, we'll get to know and hear the instruments of the family called the backbone of the orchestra, the strings. They're called that because there are more strings than any other instrument, and they're very protective of their important status. Notice how they always clamor to get the best seats right down in front of the orchestra, closest to the conductor and the audience. Now, actually, I think they're the backbone because without strings, we wouldn't have an orchestra. We would have a band. As with all the families, when we get around to talking about them, we'll describe each instrument's characteristic sound, their range of pitches, high to low, and how the sound is produced. Finally, I'll suggest a piece or two that shows off the family of instruments we've just met. Maybe it's my favorite piece of music, maybe it'll become your favorite piece of music. I'm sure most of you know the people who make up our fun little professional orchestra called Sinfonia, since our home theater, the Centennial, has some really great seats and great sight lines to get to see the players in an up-close and personal way. For example, have you noticed the fun and sometimes very silly socks worn, especially around Christmas time, by our wonderful principal double bassist, Anne Duranceau? Have you ever heard our very versatile, our great violinist, Edgar Bridwell, play jazz on his violin or even on guitar? Can you guess who is the tallest person in the orchestra? Here's a little hint. He occupies a position in the back of the group and plays his instruments either standing up or sitting on a stool. How about this one? Who plays the instrument with the highest pitches in the orchestra? How many languages are spoken by members of Lions Gate Sinfonia? All these and more fun little tidbits will be uncovered over the course of the next several videos. And remember, we love to get your questions and comments, lionsgatesinfonia.com. Okay, let's get into it. Here we go with our intro to the string family. Orchestras are made up of a great variety of instruments that belong to one of 4 basic families. And we're going to start with the group that has the most members of the orchestra, the strings. And there's a basic premise at work here and in all the families. The bigger the instrument, the lower and deeper the sound. From the highest tones and smallest string instruments to the deepest and biggest, we have the violins, violas, cellos, and double bass. Violins and their slightly larger cousins, the violas, are small enough to be held and tucked under the player's chin. The cello is about, say, 3 times that size, and the player has to rest their precious instrument on a metal end pin that goes into the floor, and they straddle their instrument in a lovely musical hug. And then there's the big old double bass or contrabass or bass violin, which is so big the player has to stand or sit on a tall stool behind it. The sound of these instruments is created by getting a string to vibrate over the hollow wooden box. Have you ever twanged an elastic rubber band? The vibrating string is achieved in one of two ways. Number one, a bow of very finely carved wood in a slight arc that has horsehair attached end to end is drawn across a tightly wound string. Or the other way could be that the string can be plucked or snapped. That's a really cool Italian word, pizzicato. All string instruments are hollow and made of wood, with the exception of a few unique modern models made of long-lasting, weather-resistant carbon fiber or some kind of other durable material. The three most famous violin makers, or luthiers, were from Cremona, Italy. There was Nicola Amati, born in 1596, died in 1684. He was one of the earliest and the biggies. He's one of the most important ones. Then Andrea Guarneri, who lived from 1626 to 1698. And the very famous Antonio Stradivarius. He was born in 1644, died in 1737. All three of these and their families of instrument makers were from Cremona, Italy. During what is called the golden age of violin making, they created their violins by using the finest aged and preserved pieces of wood and carving them into intricate patterns and using state-of-the-art glues and varnish. The gorgeous and rich sound quality of the instruments from those 300 or 400 years ago have yet to be duplicated or explained. There's something about the specific woods, combinations of spruce and willow and maple. Maybe it's the aging process, the baking of the varnish. Who knows how the miraculous sounds were produced by these gentlemen and their families. All these instruments have 4 strings that are held in place at one end of the instrument and stretched over the hollow body and anchored to a peg at the other end that can tighten or loosen the string for exact tuning. Now, we've all heard of the term catgut strings. Well, that's sort of a real thing. They sort of existed. Early strings were actually made from tightly twirling and twisting the intestines of lambs or other larger animals, because cat's guts were really too small and too short. But these have mostly been replaced nowadays by metal and synthetic materials. And by the way, the term for these so-called violin makers is luthier, which is a French word that comes from the lute, an early string instrument which was one of the forerunners of current orchestral string instruments. And luthiers made all of the sizes of string instruments, not just violins, but also violas, cellos, and double basses. Okay, let's hear all of these instruments of the string family from highest to lowest. First up, the violin.
Hi, my name's Edgar, and I'm a violinist in Lions Gate Sinfonia. I've always loved the violin, and when I was 4, I asked my parents if I could take violin lessons. And in Southern Illinois, I was fortunate because we live close to university, and they said no. They said you have to wait a year, and if at 5 you still want to take violin lessons, then we'll see what we can do. So when I was 5, I asked my parents if I could take violin lessons, and they said yes, and they signed me up for lessons with a wonderful teacher. And I continued studying when we moved to Vancouver. And then a bunch of years later, I found out that I had a great-grandfather who played fiddle, so go figure. I play a number of styles of music. I play jazz and early music and chamber music and the symphonic repertoire that you hear with Sinfonia. The violin is the highest member of the string instruments, meaning that we have the highest note being a high E. Then we have an A, D, and a G. So You've undoubtedly noticed there are a lot more violins than any other single instrument in the orchestra, and there are a lot more strings than other instrument families in the orchestra. And that's because as strings, we don't project as well as the woodwinds or the brass or the timpanis or percussion. And so there have to be more of us to balance the overall sound of the orchestra. In the violins, you have two sections, the firsts and the seconds. And the firsts generally get a lot more of the melodies or introduce melodies earlier. And those are sometimes accompanied by or reiterated by the second violins. And the seconds tend to do a lot more rhythmic kind of things in a lot of pieces. But both sections are very, very important to the orchestra and the overall sound. And I hope that I'll see you next time we have a Sinfonia concert. Till then, bye.
And that's the violin. Now the slightly larger viola.
Hi, my name's Genevieve Mackay and I play the viola. The viola is a bowed string instrument. I've got it right here, and I'm actually just going to play a little something for you and then tell you a bit more about it. Okay, so that's just a little something that I made up as part of my less classical solo project. So you've probably noticed that with the viola, we hold it on our shoulder in the same way that a violin player would, but it doesn't sound quite the same. And that's because the viola is kind of the intermediate step between a violin and a cello. It's got sort of a medium voice, like not a high voice, not a low voice. It sits right in the middle of the pitch range for strings. And it also is quite a bit bigger than the violin. So we hold it in the same way, but it feels pretty different. I actually started on violin when I was a little kid, and I've got my violin right here because I still do teach and play it. So I'm actually going to show you the difference in size. So as you can see, my violin over here is quite a bit smaller. And that's just one of the differences. The other difference is that I don't have a really high string. It's my top string, but my low string, the C string, is probably my favorite part of the instrument, actually. Isn't it so nice and juicy? I think that's what I really loved about viola when I tried it out. I switched, actually, because I had a teacher when I was a teenager who suggested that I just give the viola a try just to see how I felt about it, and I just totally fell in love with it right there. And I've been playing it ever since.
From the violin and viola, we'll move on to the beautiful sound of the cello.
Hi, it's Sue, cello from Sinfonia. I was asked to say a few words, and one of the things that they suggested I mention is why I chose to play the cello. Well, in fact, the reason I chose the cello is because I'm a failed violinist. I started out on the violin and I was a terrible student. I never practiced. I didn't like the instrument. I didn't like the positioning. I didn't like the sound of it. And in fact, I used to practice by playing the same scales over and over again while reading a book that was propped up on my music stand. My older sister, took me to a string quartet concert hoping that I would be inspired and practice and get enthusiastic about music. And in a way I was inspired, but not quite in the way that she intended, because I was absolutely transfixed by the cello. And I decided I really wanted to play the cello, and then I had to try everything to persuade my parents to get me a cello, and I had to promise that I would practice. And in fact, I did practice. I loved practicing. I loved the instrument. There was no looking back for me. In fact, I quite often got in trouble for practicing too much. I remember there was one Christmas day when I left everybody and snuck upstairs to do some practicing, and my family weren't too happy about that. But over the past 40 years or so, I've played in lots of different groups. The CBC Radio Orchestra, which sadly is no more. I played lots of shows, including a 2-year tour with Phantom of the Opera. Lots of new music with the Vancouver New Music Ensemble. And I think I've played about 38 years with Vancouver Opera. And of course, with Sinfonia, Lions Gate Sinfonia, I think I've been playing with them almost since the inception. I might have maybe missed the first year or two. And Sinfonia is just a great little ensemble. It's the best of all possible worlds. It's small enough to make you feel like you're making chamber music, but it's big enough to feel like an orchestra, and so that we can play some really satisfying orchestral repertoire. We're definitely a very merry band of minstrels. There's lots of camaraderie, good feeling, good humor. It's really enjoyable. We love playing together. We like the material. And of course, we're led by our bespectacled and benign, affable and affirmative comrade, colleague, and conductor, Clyde, who really sets the tone for the ensemble. He's just such an incredibly good-natured and enthusiastic and inspiring guy, and of course a well-respected musician, and we all really adore him, and we love playing in the group. So I think that's about all I've got to say in this short little video, and hopefully Edgar can do some wonderful editing. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Anne, and I play the double bass. I used to be a ballet dancer in a dance company in Quebec City, and when that life was not possible for me anymore, I was lucky enough to discover the double bass. I instantly fell in love with its sound, its rich, low sound. I've always loved low voices and low sounds, so I never get tired of hearing the bass, and practicing is a joy. When I played in an orchestra for the first time, it was a revelation. Each person had practiced and played their own part, but everything came together and it created this complex and magnificent music. It was incredible then, and I still find it incredible now. So, what's particular about the double bass? Well, like the other string instruments, it has a very wide range. So part of its range overlaps with the range of the cello, with the range of the viola, and even the range of the violin. But where it sounds the best is in the low range. And that's the range only the double bass covers. Sometimes in an orchestra, you might not notice the double bass at all, particularly when it's doubling the cello, and that's when it plays the same notes as the cello, but an octave lower. What you will notice though is if the bass suddenly stops playing And it's like the floor was pulled from under the music. And the sound is lighter and it seems a little bit suspended in the air. Until the bass comes back. And it brings back this great velvety carpet of rich sound that supports the orchestra and gives it warmth and depth. Anyway, I love the double bass, and I hope you do too.
Wow, that is so fabulous to hear all those great players. Many thanks to all of our Lions Gate Sinfonia musicians for those fun instrument demonstrations and lovely little chats. And this is why Sinfonia is such a wonderful group to work with and to hear. All these really excellent players also have very fun personalities, and sometimes they're pretty silly and quirky. You know, you sometimes notice in our concert programs that there are two groups of violin players, the first violins and the second violins. There's no difference in the instruments played by these two groups. I just want you to understand why we do this. The reason is there are two groups of violins playing two different sets of music. Frequently, the first violins are playing the melody, usually up high, and the second group plays either a harmony line below and intertwining around that melody, or maybe they'll double the melody at the same pitch or an octave lower. Sometimes a composer will write also two separate viola parts, or two separate cello parts, or two separate bass parts. Sometimes even one violin part instead of two. For example, Mozart loved the viola, and in several of his works we have a first and second violin part as well as first and second viola parts. Every piece of music by every composer can be laid out differently, but the standard setup is first and second violins, violas, cellos, and basses. If you have any questions about the strings or their setup or anything else you'd like to hear me or one of our Lionsgate Sinfonia players address, just drop us a line at lionsgatesinfonia.com. Now, I promised you a suggestion of a piece of music featuring the string family, but how can I pick just one? Since the beginning of formalized groups of musicians, composers have written pieces to show off their abilities or to express an emotion or tell a story, etc. Since there are usually more strings than anything else, I think every composer who has ever lived, from Antonio Vivaldi and Johann Sebastian Bach, way back in the Baroque era, right up to Sinfonia's modern day two composers in residence, Michael Conway Baker and Christopher Tyler Nickel, they've all composed at least one piece for just the string family, leaving out, for the moment, the woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Because many composers may have started their musical education by playing a stringed instrument, they're very adept at writing very competently, very clearly for strings. However, some composers have to accept that they don't have all the knowledge and experience to write for strings. Think of, for example, a very famous and brilliant hockey player trying to coach a baseball team. They need to seek advice and assistance of a very fine expert in the field. Johannes Brahms, for example, got help from a very famous violinist when he was composing his violin concerto, and so did Tchaikovsky. They were both very fine, very highly respected composers and piano players. My dear friend Michael Conway Baker asked for help from the harp player for whom he was writing his harp concerto to make sure that he got it all right, and Liz Volpe helped him create a fantastic harp concerto, which we're going to be playing in January or March, sometime when we get back onto the stage. And listen, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Tiger Woods still has a golf coach, and my favorite baseball player from decades past, hammer and home run hitter Hank Aaron, had a batting instructor. Okay, I'm going to suggest a piece now, yes, just one, that everyone can listen to, and I have to tell you, it's my favorite composer's most famous piece. Many of you might be able to guess already, especially if you've seen the Academy Award-winning movie Amadeus. Antonio Salieri was the well-established court composer in the recognized musical capital of the world, Vienna, and then young Wolfgang came along. In the movie, Salieri is trying to demonstrate for his priest some of his music, and when none of Salieri's own tunes were recognizable, he played a little snippet of a string piece that the priest immediately recognized. You remember that scene? Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart composed a lovely 5-movement serenade for strings called Eine kleine Nachtmusik, a little night music. Let me recommend to you a recording by a very fine Canadian group out of Montreal, Les Violons du Roi, conducted by Bernard Labadie. And there's also the English group, the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, led by Iona Brown, violinist and conductor. And then there's the Berlin Philharmonic with Herbert von Karajan. How about the Vienna Philharmonic with Karl Böhm and many others, available on YouTube or right there in your own living room record, tape, or CD collection. Hey, here's a thought. Why don't we all find our own favorite and tell each other what we liked about it? So I think by now we're all pretty familiar with the string family, but please ask if there are any additional questions. Our next Clyde Chat will feature the woodwind family, flutes and oboes and clarinets and bassoons. Oh my. See you again soon at Sinfonia.